everybody. Hi. And our Anabolic Aces.
Hi.
We're going to introduce ourselves in just a second. So today we're talking to you guys about how to heal your brain, how to prevent Alzheimer's and dementia, and what the signs are, and all that sort of stuff. So, So this is kind of a little bit about who we are and why we're here. So I'm Natasha, I'm half of Anabolic Aces, and my degree is in chemistry, and Chad and I are both certified in functional diagnostic nutrition. That's the paradigm within which we work as health coaches. My personal background, like I said, I have bachelor's in organic chemistry, and I worked in the drug discovery field and the pharmaceutical industry. Actually, so I'm a little bit familiar with that side of things, and then ended up switching to kind of more natural approaches. And I have a background and experience in teaching various movement arts like Pilates and aerial arts and things like that. And here's Chad.
Hi everybody, I'm Chad. I'm also certified in functional diagnostic nutrition. My background is actually in psychology. I started out working as a counselor in a clinical setting with all sorts of mental illness, substance abuse, lots of just neurochemistry and neurodegenerative processes going on there. But I was looking, not really seeing a lot of headroom being made in kind of the traditional methods, so I started doing a lot of years of research of trying to figure out what are some of the alternative ways, what are some of the maybe like deeper or more natural ways to approach this to help with that. And I've also worked for 12 years as a automotive technician, which is kind of a different, very analogous but different thing of like fixing cars, where looking at things as a system. It's like I always say to people, do you want your engine to work or your brakes to work on your car? It's like, well, preferably all of them at once, right? So we need the whole system functioning as a whole. So now kind of do that with people instead of with cars. Talking a little bit more about our approach today. Our approach, coming from the functional perspective, what we're trying to do is to restore and upgrade brain function. And that's kind of like the difference between like a process of neurodegeneration, of like basically getting worse, versus regeneration, of regenerating or getting better. Instead of focusing on just reducing the symptoms, we're going to focus on optimizing the function of the body and the systems. That's what's going to really provide that kind of synergy and healing opportunities for the body to heal itself, as opposed to like the endless kind of cycle of trial and error. With a symptom pops up, it's like trying to play whack-a-mole, kind of like trying to knock things down. It creates a lot of frustration. It creates a cycle of kind of chasing your tail, as opposed to getting to the root causes and the underlying mechanisms. And that's kind of what we're going to explore today. And the way that we try to have that kind of like regeneration and optimization is by removing, two things. Removing the blocking factors, which are kind of anything that's making the problem worse, and increasing the supports, which is something that's going to make it better. And those can be from a variety of, kind of inputs and outputs on either side. So we're going to start off just with defining kind of like what is neurodegeneration. There's a lot of terms and a lot of different kind of processes, but they have some common themes. So that's the first thing we're going to go through. It's just some stats on brain dysfunction to start off. Kind of how bad is this problem? What, is it something, something that is getting better, is getting worse? Like a lot of things these days, kind of with modern medicine, and modern lifestyle in general, it seems like they're kind of like increasing. The numbers that they would see, even like 20, 30, 50 years ago, the rates are going higher and higher. And today we're going to look at some of those underlying causes of why that might be. Some stats on this: 40% of people age 65 or older have what's called age-associated memory impairment, which is about 16 million people. So that's a lot of people that have that bad of it. 10% of people age 65 or older have mild cognitive impairment, and nearly 15% develop Alzheimer's disease each year. But this is the thing that surprised me when I researched this, was that 22% of middle-aged adults and 14% of adults aged 18 to 39 also complain of poor memory loss and focus. Now, this is the kind of thing that, to me, is kind of like an alarm bell. It's like, if people earlier and earlier are starting to see those symptoms of cognitive decline, they're already losing focus, they're already losing their memory earlier, there's got to be some kind of common underlying process that's going on, aside from, you know, what has been typically thought of as the kind of the causes and effects of this.
So just kind of go over just kind of what does it mean to have dementia or Alzheimer's. Dementia is basically any brain disorder that affects the communication and performance of daily activities. So anytime you're kind of, you know, forgetting something, kind of like, you know, what some of you were saying, like you just did something, but oh, you can't remember that you did it, that's, you know, that's a sign. It's kind of like the sore throat of neurodegenerative disease. It's like when you have a sore throat, you know something is about to happen, you're about to get sick. So it's little signs like that that point to neurodegenerative diseases. And Alzheimer's in particular is kind of speeding up of the aging process of the brain, and it affects the parts of the brain that control thought, memory, and language. And I'm sure that's, you know, that's kind of something you're all familiar with. Somebody with Alzheimer's will have trouble remembering things, they might have trouble speaking, they might have trouble understanding things. Huntington's disease is just kind of under the umbrella of general neurodegeneration, is a fatal genetic disorder. That Parkinson's disease is another neurodegenerative disease. Again, you know, some of you might be familiar with that. Predominantly affects the dopamine production and, you know, results in tremors and things like that. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, rapid decline of thinking, muscle movement confusion, difficulty walking, mood changes, things like that.
And kind of one of the big points in this that I didn't realize until looking into this was like that dementia is kind of like the overall umbrella, basically. It's a term, it's kind of like a catch-all term for cognitive decline, and then there's the different subsets underneath that. Alzheimer's is one specific subset of that, but there's also these other ones. So today we're going to focus more on the Alzheimer's process, but then also kind of like the dementia cascade in general. So if we look at kind of like the biology of dementia, just like the underlying processes, how it starts. The way that, if you look at like the age groups, the people that have it, you know, you can see here, like ages like 65 to 85, you see the amounts tend to go up pretty quickly. If there's depression is a big risk factor, it doubles the rates in females and quadruples on the males. And the warning signs, typical symptoms that people notice with decline are going to be things like memory loss, slower reaction times, balance coordination, lower mental acuity.
And the thing is, these symptoms start pretty early on in life, and they don't have to be severe. So kind of like what we're saying, you know, anytime like you're, you know, having any of these things, it's a sign of neurodegeneration. What that means basically is that something is happening in your brain that it's not functioning as optimally as it could. So that's why we're looking at all these early warning signs. So yeah, just kind of continuing with the biology of dementia.
Yeah, so neurodegeneration, it begins, if it begins early and if it's unattended, that's where it gets to like the pathological state. It can, you know, for a lot of us every day we have bad days, you know, when we can't remember something, but if it gets to the point where it's interrupting, you know, your daily function, daily routines, that's when it starts being classified as an actual disease process. Loss of neuroplasticity can explain some of the early features of dementia. And neuroplasticity is kind of like the ability of the brain to adapt and change, to learn new things, and the actual physiology to change. That's something that really makes us human. It's the ability for our brains, kind of like a supercomputer. It's like a cloud document, kind of, you know, it's going to be edited on the fly and changed and adapted. So neurons and pathways, those need to be able to be kind of dynamic and adjust, and when they lose that ability, it's harder for people to learn new skills. It's harder for people to kind of maintain just, you know, the function that they previously had. And cognitive reserve enables the brain to withstand or buffer the early stages of neurodegeneration. And cognitive reserve is kind of like, we talk about not only cognitive reserve, but just vital reserve in general in your body. The more kind of like stocked up your body is on things like vitamins, nutrients, foods, you know, hormone balance, all those sort of things, that gives you kind of a buffer that even when you have some of these stressors, it's not going to hit as hard and it won't create that cascade downwards in function. So these are the 7 stages that kind of show that progression, where it goes from you know, stage 1, like appearing normal, but you kind of have some lapses, to like forgetting things,
Anybody
mostly functioning.
experienced that ever? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
It kind of gets more severe as time goes on, where it might start affecting work. It might, you know, it might start affecting, once it starts affecting the daily routine, like basic things like eating, getting dressed, you know, and then all the way up to like speech loss, you know, disorientation, really severe things. So the kind of main takeaway here is, if we see those kind of early stages, that's where we want to catch it, and that's where we can really do not even just stopping or slowing, but even reversing the process to really give the brain the things that it needs to heal itself before it gets so degenerated that, you know, it's, you know, atrophied, and it's going to be a much bigger task. So now getting to Alzheimer's, this is one of the, like we said, one of the specific cases of dementia. So 50 to 70% of all dementia cases are Alzheimer's. It's the 6th leading cause of death in the U.S. Yeah, in certain age groups. It's kind of like the neurosyphilis of the 21st century, where it's getting to be just like, you know, kind of like an epidemic. Yeah. And most conventional treatments have considered this something that's uncurable. And that's kind of one of the big things that we're here to kind of talk about today. Really the big point is that there are things that you can do to help your brain. It's not just this kind of, you know, death sentence of genetics. So this is the progression of, kind of a similar progression of dementia with Alzheimer's, where, you know, you can see over the time span of a few years here, where it begins in certain parts of the brain, like it starts in the medial temporal lobe, and then as the disease progresses and basically more degeneration happens, it spreads to these other areas of the brain. And these areas of the brain are related to areas that, you know, affect certain things. So once it spreads, for example, to the frontal lobe, that's, you know, like the executive functioning prefrontal cortex part, where you're going to get things that correlate with that, like poor judgment. So it kind of makes logical sense as it kind of moves from one area of the brain to the next. You're going to lose the function as that part deteriorates, and that's why we kind of see this like predictable decline.
Yeah, so here's kind of a picture of a neuron. Neuron is a cell in your brain, and these are, you know, some of its functions, where kind of the anatomy of the neuron. Stats on that. Your brain has over 100 billion nerve cells, so that's pretty important to remember. The brain is made up of approximately 60% saturated fat, and that's the reason that fat is so important in your diet. So that's what the function of these neuron cells is, to transmit messages. So it kind of has this cell body, this signal receptor, the cell body, conduction, this axon, and then the terminal, where the messages are transmitted with neurotransmitters. So it's like this synaptic connection that happens. Neurotransmitters pass through the neuron cells and send signals. And that's kind of how the signaling in the brain works. And what can happen is those those cells get damaged, and that's why some of those synaptic connections are just not happening. It's like a misfire in a car engine or something like that, where, you know, the signal is trying to get to the right place, but it just can't, because the cells are getting damaged. And it's just kind of a, you know, some of the pictures of, you know, healthy brain, and then degeneration. You can see kind of areas parts of the brain just literally dying. Some of those cells are gonna start to die, and that's how you end up with cognitive decline. So you literally have fewer cells in your brain, and then the cells are getting damaged, so they can't transmit the signal. So there are some conventional treatments for Alzheimer's. You can get pharmaceutical drugs. Here's the thing, you guys, they don't work. They're literally clinically proven to not work to treat Alzheimer's disease. And here's the statistics. 99.6% of Alzheimer's drugs on the market, they just don't work to cure the disease. If anything, at best what they do is they give you about an extra 3 months to live at home before you're transferred to a care facility and you can no longer function. Now this is, again, by the time you get to the point where you need pharmaceutical intervention and you need these drugs, and then it's right before you lose your function and your cognitive abilities, and the drugs, they don't work. Big Pharma makes too much money to not continue to sell the drugs. Like I said, I worked in the pharmaceutical industry, and I kind of understand that process, and the pharmaceutical industry is driven by the bottom line, and so they will continue to push out the drugs even if they don't work. Did I mention the drugs don't work? Did somebody have a question? Did you have a quick question?
Aricept is the same as Donepezil?
I'm gonna have to get back to you on that after the presentation.
Because I'm in between two doctors.
Okay, yeah, we can talk after. Yeah. So the thing with how the kind of traditional medical approach works is Western science. That's how the research works is we need to isolate a single variable, test it, control for that, create a drug for that one single variable, and hope that it works. The problem is the body is not composed of single isolated variables. It's kind of everything is connected, so that's why it doesn't really work. You can't isolate one single process in the body, target that process, and hope that it fixes the whole problem, because the problem is always multifaceted. It's never dependent on one single variable. And yeah, here's the thing. Holistic protocols can't be patented and sold. So the big pharma can't make money on that. Like if they tell you to eat more fish and more protein and less sugar, they can't patent that and make money on it. That's why we're here. We're here to tell you that. All right, so here, you like this slide.
So basically what do we do with that information? The traditional approach is kind of like this, like let's just keep doing the same thing and let's do it twice as fast. Let's keep, one drug doesn't work, let's do 2 drugs.
Yep.
Let's just keep going with more of it. There's this slide we really like. So as we've exhausted all conventional measures, one last desperate option is to put you on an alternative natural medicine that has a 96% success rate. So that's kind of where we're at.
We didn't make this up. We found this. We subscribe to this notion. So. And it's a pretty good one.
And all joking aside, that really is kind of what we're about to present here is things that can help. They're not honestly that hard to do. There's a lot of things, but if you kind of chip away at them in each area, and we're going to go through all the different areas here, can make some big impacts pretty quickly on how you feel and how your brain works. And we've experienced it ourselves, and we've seen it plenty of times, and that's what we're here to share today. So along that line, some myths that we wanted to go over about that, specifically related to Alzheimer's, that it's not a death sentence. It's not something that I have the genetic predisposition, or so my family had it. That's it. I'm going to get it. There's nothing to do. Not true. It should be a very rare disease because it's an advanced neurodegenerative disease that it's basically probably been going on for decades and decades of those same stressors just kind of atrophying more and more and more. It's definitely something that can be prevented and even reverse depending, on the stages that you catch it. I personally think no matter what stage you're at, you might as well start doing the good stuff. If you're still alive, if you're still breathing,
Yep.
let's do something.
It's not too late.
The body's an amazing machine if you give it what it needs to heal. And yeah, the genetic predisposition is responsible for less than 2% of Alzheimer's cases. One of our favorite sayings about genetics is that genetics loads the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. That's the thing. You can have a loaded gun sitting there all day. It's not going to hurt you if you pull the trigger on it. And that's the things that you have control over. That's the empowering part. You have control over your lifestyle and the choices you make. And also, this process is basically, it's not just aging, it's abnormal aging. It's like accelerated, much a more aggressive aging process than what we would see, like say in cultures like tribal cultures that they study. I don't know if anyone's familiar here with Weston A. Price, who studied back in the 1920s and 30s around that time. Tribal cultures where they looked at these people, and they were basically kind of like the live long and drop dead model, where they'd be in their 90s, still walking around and kicking, and then one day they drop dead, or get eaten by a lion or something. But it wasn't this very kind of steady linear progression of function that we see in our modern world. So and there's, like Natasha was saying, there's no one, just like there's no one cause, there's no one gene that's responsible for it. There's hundreds of thousands of genes in the body. They all interact together, so you can't isolate just one and say, okay, that's the end all be all of it. And yeah, our main point is to not just wait for the diagnosis and then watch your brain degenerate. Be empowered, and that's what we're here to do today.
Yeah, recognize the early warning signs, and you can start doing something about it now.
Yeah. Talk about the wellness scale.
Yeah, sure.
Our other favorite slides.
Yeah, the wellness scale is, kind of one of our favorite things. Where, if you kind of don't have to say this out loud, but maybe take a look at the wellness scale. Where no one's at 0. We're all breathing here. We're all sitting here. But kind of assess kind of where you are on this wellness scale today. What percentage of function you feel like you're at, and generally what we find is that conventional medicine tends to operate in kind of the bottom third of the wellness scale. So you go to the doctor when you already have symptoms, when you have some kind of diagnosed condition, you're in serious condition. This is where acute care, like if you have an emergency or something like that, obviously you would go to a traditional hospital to get emergency care and that sort of thing. However, the conventional medicine stops at right about here, where they can't really help you with all these kind of higher function, higher level things. And then natural medicine steps in. Naturopaths are wonderful at prescribing kind of like alternative treatments, suggesting lifestyle recommendations and things like that. The only issue with that is most of them still tend to operate within the health insurance model. So once there's no insurance code that they can bill you for, unless they operate outside of the insurance model, there's still not much they can do for you. They can suggest, kind of some supplements and things like that. But once you have no symptoms and you feel like your energy is pretty good, there's usually not a whole lot more that the naturopathic care can offer you. And this is where functional medicine and functional health coaching steps in, where we look at what else is above the kind of no symptoms on the wellness scale, where you can get higher energy, you can reach your optimal functioning, you can reach your potential, and that's where we look at underlying subclinical symptoms. Subclinical meaning that anybody who works in kind of the clinical setting is not going to look at those symptoms. They're going to tell you your results are normal. So that's where people like us come in, or functional medicine doctors, and we look at not just what's normal, but what's optimal, and we shoot for optimal. And how we do it is we don't just focus on the surface level symptoms, because by the time you have surface level symptoms, you have a whole lot more going on underneath, some things that have been building up before the symptoms showed up, right? So it's all this dysfunction building up, and that's what we look at underlying chronic stress-related dysfunctions. Because again, usually by the time you have symptoms, something has been building up for a long time, so you have some kind of chronic underlying condition. Okay, so we kind of touched a little bit on the causes of Alzheimer's, and just gonna cover that real quick again. It's a misconception, I feel like, that Alzheimer's is genetic. Just because someone in your lineage had Alzheimer's, it doesn't mean that you're destined to have Alzheimer's. More than 98% of the disease is caused by lifestyle, not your genetics. And again, it goes back to that whole notion that genes load the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. It's what your body is exposed to, the food you put into your body, your environment, that's what activates or deactivates the genes, and all of that is your external lifestyle. It's not your internal genetic predisposition. And inflammation in the body can turn on inflammation in the brain, and that's kind of how that whole cascade builds up. The stress cascade affects the brain, so the more stressful your lifestyle is, the more your brain is affected. Mitochondrial damage is at the heart of neurodegeneration. Mitochondria are the part of your cell where energy is made, and we're gonna actually have a slide on that, so I'll kind of talk a little bit more about what mitochondria are and their role in neurodegeneration. And another interesting fact is low blood pressure is a good predictor of Alzheimer's disease. So if you have any of these kind of conditions associated with low blood pressure, again, the reason is your brain requires healthy supply of nutrients. If you have low blood pressure, you have kind of a lower supply of nutrients to the brain.
What is
Question?
considered low blood pressure?
Sorry?
What is considered low?
You mean like numbers?
Yeah.
We can get back to you on that after the presentation.
Isn't hypertension, you have hypertension in
Ha! That's a typo. Sorry, thank you for pointing that out. Hypotension.
I have to follow that along in the husband.
Yep, thanks for pointing that out. Hypotension.
Well, I mean, you don't want it to be too high or too low, basically.
Yeah.
You want it to be in the right amount.
But you're right. Low blood pressure would be hypotension. Kathy?
And with low blood pressure, I have low blood pressure, but I'm told that it's a healthy low blood pressure. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So I think there's
I do know what you mean, and that goes back to
and then low where it's
Yeah.
unhealthy low.
Numbers, 'cause,
Yeah.
I have low
Yeah.
Like mine
Okay,
was
so
on
that's
the
kind of
60s or
related
something.
to the the normal range, for all of the biomarkers versus what's optimal range. So yeah, so just because the doctors say you have low blood pressure doesn't necessarily mean it's unhealthy low. But yeah, we can talk about the exact numbers after.
Can I say
And-
one other thing that
Uh-huh.
I've learned, and I'm just learning,
Uh-huh.
is that when I used to be tested,
Mhm.
from regular medical doctors, correct me if I'm wrong, the normal that I used to receive, my understanding was that it was, when I was tested, it was based on people that were not healthy.
Exactly.
And
That's the
so
whole issue
my-
with the reference ranges.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
my normal was based on people that were sick,
Yep.
right? And so I believe that you test
Mhm.
based on people that are healthy.
Yeah.
And so now if I get tested by you,
Right.
then my normal,
Yeah.
what I get back will be based on healthy people, which is
Yeah.
what I want.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
what
Is
we
that-
do is we our program Functional Diagnostic Nutrition determines optimal reference range versus just normal reference range, and that's kind of
Or
what
even
you're
normal
referring
based on
to.
sick people. which is
Exactly,
not
because
what I
the
want.
normal reference ranges for a lot of the markers that you might get tested at the doctor are based on a fairly unhealthy population. And in fact, I don't know if you guys knew this, as the population gets more unhealthy, what they do is they take the reference range and they literally move it.
Yeah.
So it becomes the new normal, but it's not optimal.
It just,
And
really brings
that's-
back to the point of the symptom chasing thing.
Yeah.
That if you're chasing symptoms, you're never going to stop. And
Right.
so that's what we're going to get
Exactly.
into here is with this slide is really going into these are the big kind of levers that we can pull on the big causes. Things like, stress in the body causing inflammation, causing damage to the cells. If we reverse that, your blood pressure is going to normalize anyway. So that's what we like to
And
look
it doesn't
farther
matter what the
upstream.
number is, you're just gonna have your own optimal
That's why
blood
it's so
pressure.
difficult to say what
Yes.
it is.
Yeah. So our big paradigm brings us perfectly to this. Our big paradigm that we always use in our coaching is dress for brain success. Dress for any kind of success, health success, heart health, whatever you're looking for. And those components are diet, rest, exercise, stress reduction of all kinds, including internal stresses inside the body, and supplements to either help heal something that's an acute problem, or just to supplement and maintain a lot of the time, just because we live in a tough world. Got to make it work somehow.